Good morning. This is Jason Dean coming live at you again for another Film Fanatic show. Hope everyone's doing good. It is Saturday morning, 9:53. Happy solstice. This is the first day of summer. So June 21st. Here we are, 2025. Hope everyone's doing good. I did a couple of different shows this week. I'm in the midst of uploading a new music show. I did a show on one of my favorite Miles Davis albums of all time, and I was really late to the game in really discovering it, and that is Sketches of Spain. In the process, that's going to premiere in a couple of days or so next week. And also, I just did a show recently where I just talked about kind of a yearly roundup of films for 2025. And I talked about, I've seen quite a few new movies this year, and in all honesty, it's been a pretty disappointing year, I think, for movies. I thought 2024 was a outstanding year for movies. There was so many great films that came out, and the other thing was each film that I remember seeing last year that stood out, whether it was Long Legs or The Substance or In a Violent Nature, Maxine. I mean, just a really great list of newer horror films, especially when it comes to horror films. They were all like just really diverse and really unique, and they all had their own voice. But this year has been pretty disappointing. One movie I saw this year that I thought easily is the best new horror movie, that surprisingly, I've been really surprised that it's not really talked about enough. It and that is Osgood Perkins' The Monkey, which was more or less adapted from a Stephen King story. Osgood Perkins, of course, last year directed Longlegs, which was kind of a huge success. It starred Nick Cage. I love that movie. I think it's awesome. That was the movie that really made me pay attention to Osgood Perkins as a director. And out of all the movies I've seen this year, that movie is definitely the best one, and definitely the best horror film, aside from it being probably the best movie and probably the most cohesive story and just the most entertaining. So yeah, check out those videos. And so today is a little bit of a different show. It's going to be about the recent anniversary, which was actually yesterday, and that is the 50th anniversary of Jaws, the epic horror film that was released in 1975 by Steven Spielberg. Incredible year when that film came out. I was born in '75, and it is, um, that movie really changed cinema forever. It was a watershed moment. It really was. It changed. Well, it changed films forever. It changed. It was a piece. Became a piece of cinematic history, and it's influenced so many movies. And so I wanted to do a little show where I'm talking about the iconic classic Jaws. And starting things off, Jaws is one of those movies. It's kind of funny, but Jaws is one of those movies I've seen so many times that I can't even count. It's uh, it's definitely one of the greatest movies. It's probably, of course, it was directed by Spielberg, and I'm a big Steven Spielberg fan, especially in his earlier part of his career. I think some of his later films were somewhat missteps, but and it's actually quite a few years old now, but I kind of regard it as one of his more relatively more recent films. But I really love Minority Report, starring Tom Cruise, based on the Philip K. Dick story. That's one of his somewhat later films, even though now it's quite a few years old. I think that movie is super awesome. It's one of the best. It's one of my favorite sci-fi movies that he's ever done. But then, I always go back to Steven Spielberg's career, where he has done action movies, science fiction especially. Jaws is, without an exception, I think that that movie is a pure-blooded horror film, and I almost think that that movie is a slasher movie in a lot of ways. But I always go back to, it's easy to say that probably Jaws is his best film, but I really, really love Close Encounters of the Third Kind. I think that movie is a phenomenal masterpiece. I also really love his first film, Duel, starring Dennis Weaver, which was actually a TV movie. And so, and he's well known for other films like Saving Private Ryan, an endless amount of movies that he's directed. The Indiana Jones films, the first few, not the more recent ones, which are trash. Just an endless amount of fantastic movies that he directed in his earlier part of his career. But I think it's pretty safe to say, Jaws might be his best film. That movie was. It's one of those movies I wish I could travel back in time and, got to see it in the theater when it came out, because that movie really terrified people. And for me, it still has that effect. It still keeps me from going swimming in the ocean. I mean, without a doubt. And even though the film came out as of yesterday, 50 years ago, it's hard to believe that the the how far reaching the effects of that movie have been over the decades, and still now you still see it as that movie being such a huge influence on movies today. With there's still more or less shark films coming out. There's still movies coming out in the horror genre where there are monsters or predators in the sea. So just an incredible world that movie it just changed the entire world of cinema, and especially horror films. And I'm going to talk about the exploitation movies that I really, really love, and talk about those movies because they were really just ripoffs of Jaws. Jaws was one of the first kind of movies that when it came out in the theaters, it was a phenomenon. Like, it was a massive, massive hit, and it was kind of one of the first, if you want to call it that, but really one of the first, like, in a lot of ways historically, one of the first giant Hollywood blockbusters. It was one of those films where people were just enamored with it when it came out. People saw it in the theater numerous times. I've talked to people who, and my parents and other people who were older, who saw it when it came out, and that visceral experience of getting a chance to see Jaws in the theater. And as many times, it's one of those movies, kind of like, and there's a bunch of movies like that, but I always think of it as like, in comparison to, say, The Godfather, my favorite movie of all time, of course, directed by Francis Ford Coppola. That's one of those movies I grew up, I've seen that movie so many times I can't even count. And it's one of those movies, if I'm ever, like, it's happened a lot, like going over to my family's house or whatever, back when cable was a regular thing. If it was ever on TV, uh, Godfather, for instance, and this same exact thing for films like Jaws. If it was on TV in the background, like if I happened to go over their house, and for whatever reason, if it was on, and it didn't matter, where, whether it was like halfway into the movie or towards the end, or it just started. It's one of those movies I stop everything that I'm doing and I will sit down and watch it, hands down. It's one of those kinds of rides that I want to be on. And I grew up, watching that movie. It was like a regular staple in my diet of watching films. It was always something we would watch as a family. It was a movie that, one of the first kind of horror films that truly terrified me. And it's still, I think now, watching it now, like it's still so deeply impactful. Like there's nothing dated about it. I got to see it. It was a pretty decent restoration of it. It wasn't great though. It was a little bit. I wasn't sure where they got this particular version of it, but it was still. I mean, the movie is just such a masterpiece. It was still an amazing experience. But about a year or two ago, there was a screening of Jaws at the Waldo Theater, and I went with a friend to it, and it was amazing. It was absolutely amazing. And I believe the friend I went with to see it had never really seen it before, and that was wild. That just it blows my mind. Sometimes that happens a lot when I go to a movie. You know, lately I had been going to the Waldo Theater. They did a big series on David Lynch, and I went met a friend there who had never seen any of these movies, and I was just like, it kind of just threw me off or blew me away because some of these movies I've seen again so many times I can't even remember. I couldn't count, couldn't give you a number. And Jaws is one of those movies, but it was great seeing it on the big screen. That particular transfer or version or DVD or Blu-ray, whatever they used, wasn't the greatest. It was the quality was a little bit well, kind of crappy, but it was still amazing to see it on the big screen. That also happened ironically when I went to go see The Godfather. I remember about 2 3 years ago they had a special screening of that on at the Colonial Theater, and that was not very good. But I am so in love with both of those films. I still enjoyed the experience, and it was still technically great to see it on a big screen, even though the transfers or that particular way or version of that film was not really great, and I'm not sure why. The Waldo After Dark group series is amazing because they use usually really high definition Blu-ray or 4K releases and or high-end Blu-ray DVD discs, and the quality is amazing. The transfer is amazing. So, but anyway, the thing is, I've seen Jaws again so many times I couldn't give you a number, but ironically, I don't even own it, which is weird. And I need to. I don't know why I don't own that movie. There's been I think it was last year they put out a special edition of it on 4K. I don't own a 4K player, and I'm really reluctant to get a 4K player just because that means I have to buy, another copy of a movie that I love, and I already have. There's a lot of movies I own where I have already like 5 copies of them. So I don't know. And I've heard that sometimes with 4K, not every movie, there isn't that much of a significant difference sometimes between a really good, high-end Blu-ray and a 4K. So I'm on the fence about it, but I'm probably not going to go down that route. But there are a bunch of different editions of Jaws on Blu-ray. I did look around for one once or twice, and I never really found one that I felt really good. Like I wanted to buy one that has a bunch of special features. It's a collector's edition, but I will make it a thing to definitely do that. But ironically I don't own it on Blu-ray, which is super weird. My folks actually own it on DVD. They have a really really good quality DVD version of it, and I've borrowed that from them. But even though I don't own it on Blu-ray or 4K, I have still seen it, a bazillion times on cable growing up as a kid, and then renting it on DVD over the years, and what have you. And of course, starring Roy Scheider, one of the greatest iconic actors in the '70s, and then Richard Dreyfuss, the iconic role of Richard Dreyfuss. I mean, you know, just just such a masterpiece. I mean, it's one of those movies. Like, what else can you really say about it? Because everything has been said. But it truly is one of those movies that is a real special place. It holds a real special place in my heart, and especially when it comes to horror films and films that are generally scary. That movie is a popcorn movie and it's entertaining and it's got a lot of heart and soul, but it's when you get down to it, that movie is truly terrifying, especially the opening sequence. I mean, it's hard not to find a movie that's any scarier than that, really. Um, and I often think like, wow, I can only imagine what that was like to see for the first time, not really knowing anything about it in a theater with a bunch of people. That must have been such an intense experience, really. I can't forget the iconic actor Robert Shaw, one of the greatest actors in Hollywood, one of the most iconic roles in Jaws. So yeah, again, it's funny, it's ironic, and it's kind of weird that as many times as I've seen this movie, and um, as as much as I love this movie, I don't actually own it, but I will remedy that someday. It's you know, it's a timeless movie, and the other thing about this movie, it's got one of the greatest film scores ever. One of the most terrifying film scores ever, of course, by the iconic composer John Williams. One of the greatest film scores ever. He's most well known, obviously. He's worked extensively with Steven Spielberg. He did the incredible music for Close Encounters of the Third Kind, which, again, I own the that movie, Close Encounters. I own that on Blu-ray. I have an amazing Blu-ray release of that. That's one of my all-time favorite movies. I can watch that anytime. And I also have I way back when I used to be into collecting records, and I haven't had the setup for records in a while, but I do have a record, the soundtrack for Close Encounters that I that I remember buying quite a few years ago, and there's a bunch of music on the record that was not in the movie, and some of the music that was not, even some of the sequences in the movie are actually really terrifying. The abduction sequence when the UFO comes to the house and takes the little boy. It's pretty terrifying, really. And but there's a bunch of music on the record that is really terrifying, and music that was not used. I've recommended that album to many people because of course, John Williams, all the iconic music he's done for Star Wars, and he's scored, for so many films. Just one of the greatest composers. But for me, I think the best thing he ever did is Jaws. Like it's so primal and it's so utterly terrifying and intense. And so and I definitely think that when I first saw Jaws, that was the first time where I really noticed the film score, and that it's so powerful and so strong that it acts like its own character. It's hard to imagine watching Jaws without that film score. It really makes that movie. It catapults it into this new space. And again, my favorite genre is the exploitation genre. So Jaws has been one of the most ripped off or exploited movies out there. Again, it was a massive, massive phenomenon when it hit the box office and all the money that it made. It was the first. There were big films before that, obviously, but I think, in the history of Hollywood, but I think truly, Jaws was one of the first kind of, just landmark blockbusters that just was embraced by everyone, became this phenomenon, made an incredible amount of money, and just set all of these records. And I think even today, if that was to happen, if Jaws was to come out today, it would probably still have that same impact because it's such an amazing film. It's a masterpiece. I remember seeing an interview with Quentin Tarantino when he called Jaws. He felt that's an example of uh, the perfect movie. Like everything about it, the screenplay, of the music, the cinematography, the direction, the actors, the cast. the story, everything. It just being a perfect movie, and it really is. It's just a perfect movie. There's nothing on every front of that movie. It's just masterful. It's just an example of masterful filmmaking. And when it comes to exploitation, there's a whole bunch of movies that it really influenced, but then also these low budget filmmakers more or less ripped off because that's kind of the state and a big component of the world of the sleazy kind of underbelly of exploitation is where there's been thousands of examples of where there could be a movie, whether it's an American movie or a foreign movie, but typically it seems to be in a movie that is a huge hit in the states. That people will want to rip off and try to capitalize on it because it's about making money. To exploit something, that and knowing that as a filmmaker you don't have that budget, but that that movie has an audience. So how can you somehow capitalize on that on this wave of success? And that's a big component of the exploitation. And then you have the situation of where in the world of exploitation they obviously have a very very low budget, if any money, to make that movie. They're the level of actors, the caliber of actors is obviously not as good, and they have to cut corners in some ways because they just don't have the overhead. But I think in its own weird, unique way, a lot of these movies, even though they are kind of ripping something off, in this case Jaws, like wholeheartedly, the movie, the exploitation version of it, just kind of does its own thing. It has its own spin. And I feel like these movies I'm going to talk about that I feel were total ripoffs of Jaws, still, like, they're just amazing and they have their own style to them. Another movie I think that has been grossly, you know, uh, ripped off and exploited for the same reasons as William Friedkin's The Exorcist. Another movie that was a massive, massive phenomenon. Um, and you had, and then obviously Friday the 13th, which was a slasher movie when it first came out, but that movie was massively influential. John Carpenter's Halloween. Initially, that wasn't a massive commercial success, but over time, that became a massive success, and also for the world of slasher films. I mean, you have a lot of examples of that. But with Jaws, like for me, I'd say like well, my favorite slasher film of all time, Maniac, directed by Bill Luswig, is a total like ripoff of Jaws in a lot of ways. Especially the opening sequence to Maniac is hilarious because it's literally a ripoff of Jaws, where it's so obvious. But again, it's a totally throwdown. It's a totally nasty, you know, slasher movie, and it's so raw and brutal and generally hard to watch. But Bill Luswig's Maniac is my favorite, easily my favorite slasher movie. But it is, I think it's totally, safe to say that Jaws was the biggest influence on that movie. Bill Luswig even said that he wanted to create a movie where it was like Jaws on land, meaning that there's this slasher serial killer who is the shark, more or less. Another film that is really really was massively by influenced by Jaws was The Car, and which is one of my favorite low budget exploitation movies. The Car, just an amazing film. I have done a couple of shows on that, but that movie essentially was, they set out because of the success of Jaws to create this replica of Jaws, but now it's not going to be a shark in the ocean. It's going to be this demonic car that's on land that's killing people, and it's literally there's scenes in that movie where it's scene by scene, frame by frame of where they rip off Jaws, but yet Maniac and and the car are totally unique in their own weird and wacky way. Like it's its own thing. It's not like it came out in its own thing. It's got its own voice, and I think you know those two movies are in regards to horror exploitation movies. They are and slasher movies. They are um, some of my favorites. A Maniac being my favorite slasher movie of all time. I mean, that movie is, I think, untouchable. And another exploitation movie, and again, I could be here all day talking about movies, in the genre that were so influenced or that were just ripped off by exploitation movies. But these three movies I'm talking about today are movies just off the top of my head that are just really obvious. Another movie is Grizzly, which is another amazing exploitation movie that came out, and in this case, it's a this killer grizzly bear, and it's the same thing. They wanted to rip off Jaws. The filmmakers wanted to rip off Jaws but now it's going to be this monstrous grizzly bear that's tearing people to shreds and killing people in the woods. But it's exactly the same thing. And all of these filmmakers that have made these movies, don't pull any punches, with their honesty as far as what their intentions were with these movies. So, but again, Grizzly being an example, another example, and the car and Maniac, they're just amazing exploitation movies. I love them. They're so campy. They're so cheesy. They are great action movies. They're super fun and entertaining. And then especially with Maniac, which it's such a brutal, fucking movie. That's kind of almost in its own league. But the point is that they ripped off in every way that they could from Jaws, but it still made these movies iconic and masterful, and some of my favorite exploitation movies in the world of horror. So, and again, there's probably another 200 movies I could name, but I'd probably be here all day that that I could name that did the same thing more or less. But I don't think that's bad. I think that's actually, I think that's a good thing. You hear that saying sometimes: "Good composers borrow, great composers steal," and I don't think that that's a bad thing. I think there's always something, when it comes to music or art. There's always that that idea, that notion of kind of standing on the shoulder of giants. People you really admire, or people that set the bar so high in those respective genres, and and you're going to emulate them. You're going to try to copy certain things that they've done, or they're going to be this endless source of inspiration. So for whatever you're doing, it's gonna it could be a thing of where you can hear really, or it's really obvious that those influences are there, or you're just kind of ripping it off or whatever. But I think most of the time, it it kind of it will kind of come out in its own way. I think it's happened to me a few times with my band Quantum, where there's those obvious groups and bands and artists that I just I'm obsessed with and that I listen to all the time, and occasionally, like, people will say, "Oh, that really reminds me of this particular artist," and for me, that's like the highest thing that someone can say, the nicest accolade that someone can say to me, and I feel really flattered by that and inspired by that. That's happened to me a couple times where I remember a long time ago we played a show in Rockland with Quantum, and someone came up to me. There was this couple at the show, and we were we were talking. They came up to me after the show, and they really loved the set, and they were talking about how they were really into a lot of jazz and stuff. And the guy said that, yeah, that one tune that you guys were playing really reminded me of Herbie Hancock. And and I was like, wow, like that's I was kind of blown away by that because the electric Herbie Hancock stuff like Headhunters, Thrust, and most of the Headhunter stuff, but especially that album and that period of Herbie Hancock style is like the biggest, some of the biggest influence for me. And I try to listen to that music and take ideas from it all the time. And then recently we played a show, and someone came up to me. We played a song that we hadn't played in a really long time, and someone said to me, "Wow, like that really reminded me of David Bowie." And I was like, "Whoa." That blew me away. Like that's an honor that someone would say that, because I know it's never going to be on par with those other artists, in regards to Bowie and Hancock. But that was really a beautiful thing to say, because David Bowie is a massive, massive, massive influence on me. He's probably all around my favorite artist of all time. So that's a great thing. But so I think in a world of exploitation, it's gonna, it's gonna these movies that I use as examples, Grizzly, The Car, and Maniac, they all have their own, they all have their own vibe. They all have their own kind of spin on it. It's not, they all are very different, and it's in their own kind of weird, respected way. So it's totally cool. But anyway, I wanted to do a show on Jaws because the movie is just celebrating its 50th anniversary, and when it comes to horror movies, slasher movies, and just movies in general, it's one of the most iconic movies and one of the most important movies ever made, and a movie that truly changed the world of cinema, just as far as big Hollywood movies, but also in the world of horror. So thanks again, and happy solstice.